think that one of the things that I want to think about is that sometimes the inherited text we have was not likely necessarily the way the story might have been told earlier. An example here is Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. There are at least two hands at work in this story. And if you separate this out, and Jared, I'll be happy to send you what the version looks like that is probably its earlier version, and then you'll see what's been interpolated later. But if you look at that first, likely older strand, Abraham goes up the mountain of Moriah and engages in an act of resistance. He resists the command to slaughter his son and takes the ram instead. Now, a later writer interpolates a bunch of angelic interruptions to this so that it looks like the whole story is a story about his obedience. But if you separate these strands out, an earlier version of this story is a story of Abraham's disobedience, not his obedience. So I want to acknowledge that the stories that we have, all of which are complex,
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. I will say welcome back. If you've already listened to part 1 of my conversation with Barbara Thiede, you may want to stop and go listen to the previous episode. I split the interview in 2 just to see how things would work that way. So one came out on Wednesday, the other part came out on Saturday. I did backtrack a little bit from where we ended in the last conversation, so there's a little bit of overlap there, hopefully a little bit of continuity. There will be a tag at the end of this one. I didn't put a tag at the end of the other one because this was the next episode. So, thank you so much for listening. If you have guest suggestions, feedback for me, or you just want to start a correspondence, or maybe you want to come on the podcast, maybe you're the guest suggestion, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. You can also hit me up on every social media platform there is. I've finally fixed an issue that I had with the Facebook account. And so now, if you want to go over on Patreon and become a supporter for $5 a month, you can get episodes in video and audio, and they come out 10 days early over there. Or we're available on YouTube. It's audio episodes for free. Facebook, the audio episodes drop over there as well. TikTok, I do promotional clips over there. I'm considering doing additional content that's just me. So I don't know if that's a selling point or not. Instagram, I'll probably end up doing the same thing as well as on YouTube. And then I'm on Blue Sky, Spoutable, and Twitter. So hit me up over there, follow me. I try to start conversations. I try to solicit any suggestions that people might have. If you want to hear this conversation in full right now, you can go watch the full episode. It's not broken into 2 parts over on Patreon for $5 a month. That is my last comment. So with that said, here is part 2 of my conversation with Barbara Thiede. Enjoy.
So I'll give you another quick example just to kind of bring that home. In Deuteronomy, we have a text in which an Israelite soldier is told, if you see among a captive group of people a woman who is beautiful and attractive to you, you can take her. And then for a month, you may not effectively sexually assault her. You may not use her body. For a month, she's let to mourn her family. Her hair is shaved off of her head. That's the Hebrew is much more literal. Her garments are changed. She has to, her own garments are taken away. New garments are given her. Her nails have to be pared. And then after a month, you can use her as long as you want until you're tired of her. And if you're tired of her, then you have to let her go, because you have used her. And the word there that's used there is ana. You have effectively, it's one of the words that is used in rape contexts. Now, I have seen rabbis and ministers do everything they can to say, oh, look, you're dignifying this captive woman because she becomes the actual wife of the Israelite soldier. She's not just raped and then let go. She has a status. And even if she's let go, she's not allowed to be sold into slavery. So see how progressive this is? And to all of those people, I want to say, the Boko Haram took Nigerian schoolgirls out of their schools and they forced them into marriage. The Yazidi women were forced into forced marriage by ISIS warriors, forced into being raped repeatedly. They were often given the status of wife, but would we call that anything other than a systematized use and abuse of these women and their bodies, forcing them into marriage, forcing them to endure sexual assault, forcing them to become pregnant and bear children of their enemies? So if we would not accept that in a modern setting, why are we pretending that this text doesn't exist, or that we can somehow make it look better and feel better for us when it does in the Hebrew Bible, instead of taking that text and saying, oh my God, that was wrong then and it's wrong now?
I think there's an extent to which, okay, on the one hand, historical critical reading requires of you that you acknowledge what you just said. That if we lay it out starkly, what is being represented here, this is what we understand to be rape. And we should not back off of our understanding of rape because this comes in a passage of what many people believe is scripture. On the other hand, I can find something admirable about the aspirational reading of the rabbis you reference, of saying that the values and priorities and principles that we want to see in the world need to be represented, if not, so acknowledging the historical critical reading, if not in the original intent of what was happening there, at least in our reading. Is that a fair dichotomy?
So as a rabbi myself, I have had to often admire the way in which the rabbis will mess with texts until they no longer have the toxicity that they once had. I will give you an example, right? The whole law of harem, like wiping out an idolatrous city. I used to go to give this as an example in various churches. Well, there was a song that used to be sung when I was a kid. Wherever you go, there's always someone Jewish. And that was meant to, you're not going to be alone. Well, the rabbis used this principle to deal with this law. Well, let's see. Can we destroy a whole city of what should be idolaters? Well, wait a minute. Before we say yes to that, before we agree that that's okay, we have a problem, because when there are two competing laws in Hebrew Bible, the more important one takes precedence. So it's a very important law that we not desecrate the name of God. Every Jewish household has a mezuzah on its doors or its gates, which has a section from Deuteronomy. Listen, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your might, right? Deuteronomy, a famous text for both Christians and Jews. It's on your door. If you go into an idolatrous city and there is a single Jewish family there, then you will end up desecrating the name of God, because you will destroy that family and that house. So therefore, guess what? No city can ever be destroyed. Right? That's how you bypass this toxic law about what to do with an idolatrous city. And that is, on some level, a truly admirable, moral/intellectual way of just turning the text around and using another part of the text to effectively obviate the toxicity of this part of the text. On some level, that is truly intellectually and even ethically a really interesting move. So can I see where that has genuine an important impact in how we actually think about what's most important in these texts as an ethical mandate a most important thing is not desecrating the name of God, I can live with that, right? So, yeah, I can admire that. And I think you have to be constantly walking the balance between that kind of maneuver and the honest statement that when you have a text which seems to think that it's okay to go into a city, kill every man, woman, and child except for the girls that have not known a man, slaughter everybody there, and then take those women and then give them to 600 Benjaminites who need female bodies for their child to survive. You better name that for what that is, because what that is happening in our own day and time, and it's unacceptable.
I mean, with arguably fewer restraints.
Yeah.
On that, so the book ends in Judges, which is I think this might be the third time that this has come up on the podcast. I could be wrong on that, but that has been. I remember reading that as a teenager. One, Judges was not a book taught in any of the churches, at least not very frequently, when I was growing up. And two, this was a passage no one wanted to talk to me about.
That's
Like, no one. I think Alexiana Fry.
right, Jared. I'll
What's
make
that?
you bet. I'll make you bet your education didn't include the Book of Lamentations either. That's also a book that is frequently not taught in Christian settings.
Yeah, not really. I think Alexiana Fry was the first person I ever had a conversation with about her book, and that comes up, and I was 40 years old when that happened. So, not off to a great start as it applies to that. What you had to say about this priest at the end of
Mm-hmm.
Judges is probably, to me, it's the most interesting thing in this book. Yeah, I'm not probably. It's the most interesting thing in this book. Do you mind walking us through that? Since so you already introduced us where we end up in that story. Can we
Yeah,
back up and
we
go to the
can.
beginning of that story?
It's interesting that you say that because of the chapters, that one is also my favorite. It is my favorite because I think, I hope that in each chapter, my aim as a scholar is in each chapter, have I found something that is genuinely important that seems not to have been addressed before. In other words, how do you move the field forward? How do you move scholarship forward? Is by saying, wait, look at it from this lens, or check out the Hebrew here, and you suddenly have something that really will elicit further conversation. That chapter for me ended up being one of my favorites, and if not the favorite, because I had been teaching that story for years, and it's always taught. First of all, Judges 19 is often taught almost in exclusion of Judges 20 and Judges 21, right? Just this horrific story of the Levite's Pilegesh, a secondary wife. I'm not going to use the word concubine because that just calls up certain kinds of associations that aren't covered by this term. It's an anachronism. I'm not going to use it. Secondary wife, but she's a wife of some kind. She leaves her husband at the very outset. Very dangerous thing for a woman to do, to walk out into the world alone, as we also know from Genesis 34, and what happens to the young girl, Dinah, who also walks out away from her family. So this woman leaves, and for 4 months there's a separation between her and her Levite husband, because she has somehow made her way back to her father's house. And for 4 months, she is living there. And finally, the Levite decides he's going to go after her. And he travels down, and the father sees him and immediately makes him as welcome as possible. And, hospitality galore, day in, day out. We don't know whether the father we don't really know whether, first of all, the Levite's Pilegesh has left because her husband has been abusive or cruel to her, though his behavior in the rest of the story certainly seems to suggest a real lack of kindness. So we don't know if the father is afraid of him. He certainly has the authority, right? He is one of God's men. And the Levites in the Hebrew Bible, no matter which strand you place them in, and there are various narratives about the genesis of the Levites as their own group, but they always are associated with kind of being God's warriors, God's fighters, right? And they're always in the thick of war. We can just imagine the point when Moses comes down from Sinai and basically the Levites just engage in a massive slaughter in the golden calf episode. So that's their role. They are God's primary warriors. This deity is a warrior deity, and he has warrior men, and the Levites are it. So they are his kind of right-hand guy in these militaristic spaces. So it's possible that the father is afraid of him. In any case, after several days, the Levite says, no, we're finally going to leave. He takes his wife. She's never asked for her opinion or consent, and a servant. And they make their way towards his home in Ephraim, and they end up in a Benjaminite city. And they only end up getting the hospitality they need because a fellow Ephraimite, right, from the Levites' home, sees them sitting in the square. Nobody's offering them a space to come to their house with. They end up with this man who's called the host. The Levite basically says, my wife is your servant. All sorts of implications there. They start feasting. A group of men in Gibeah then storm the house, and the Levite is a stranger. The Levite is suspect, and they threaten effectively to rape him. And instead, his wife is thrown out, who is then gang raped and tormented all night long. She makes her way back to the house, and there's an absolutely horrific scene where just her fingers are on the threshold. Nobody offers her, and nobody looks for her, nobody finds her until the next morning when the Levite comes out, and then he commands her to get up. She doesn't. He throws her over the back of a donkey. It takes her home. We do not know if she is already dead or not. He cuts her body into 12 parts, sends them to the tribes of Israel. This is kind of a funky thing, right? Probably doesn't send them to the Benjaminites, right? So 12 parts, 11 of the 12 tribes are mustered to defend him, but really the deity, from the dishonor that's been done. Because the men of Gibeah, in attacking a Levite, have attacked the deity's honor. And that is the key element that people really did not seem to see in this narrative. It is the reason and the explanation that helps you understand what happens in Judges 20 and 21, which is that there's an awful lot of stuff going on between the deity and his Israelites and the Benjaminites, and they all have to do with this insult to the deity's honor. A civil war breaks out, right? There's all sorts of negotiation on the part of the Israelites who are asking the deity, what should we do to avenge you? Then there's the, oh my God, there are only 600 Benjaminites left. We'll lose a tribe in Israel. The whole story ends with all the Israelites, ends with the Israelites being reconciled to the deity after a massive, awful civil war that has been fought over the insult to his honor. And so what is critical in this story is not this woman or her body, but the insult to the Levite, and therefore the insult to the deity, and how the deity then reacts to that insult, and how that plays out among the Israelites themselves. And part and parcel of this also involves further rape on a grand scale, because in order to make it possible for Benjamin to stay and to exist as a tribe, Uh, the other Israelites, basically devastate Yabesh Gilead, destroy the men, women, and children, only take the girls who have not known a man, hand them over to the Benjaminites, effectively to be used for their bodies. A second horrific scene in which women who are dancing in a festival to the Israelite deity are then captured and also given over to the Benjaminites for use as enforced marriage, i.e., they're all effectively raped by the Benjaminites. We don't have anything about the consent of any of these women, and the trauma that we might think about that they must have undergone, right, is not so easily dismissed when you start thinking about this in more modern terms. Women being taken from their homes, seeing their families murdered, and then taken by a bunch of men who then have complete access to their bodies, or dancing in an innocent space and then being taken again. Yeah, the story is really about what happens when any one of the Israelites insult the deity, and it's rather like what David does with Uriah that I mentioned earlier, right? An insult to the deity provokes massive retaliatory response.
I think in interrogating that narrative, if you're looking at Adonai as the central character, the question I would ask of that character is, what are your values? Like, what are your aims in this story? What, I mean, so your honor, okay, what does that mean in this case? And because I do the rambly thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't. Some of the reading I've been doing from New Testament scholars who are trying to situate more New Testament texts within their Jewish context, they have brought into my field of view an understanding of sacrifice as not like a necessarily a propitiation thing or a replacement thing, so much as the Levites in enacting sacrifice were the guarantors of Adonai's presence in Israel. Mm-hmm. So the purification of sancta and sanctified spaces and keeping them sanctified is what kept Adonai in Israel's presence. And so I wonder, like, is that what Adonai's values are?
You're asking a person who just finished writing a book on how the deity operates as, I would argue, the only real male of the books of Samuel, because every other male ends up in some way or another being subordinated and feminized in relationship to this deity. So now we have to go here. I don't know if you've read God and Anatomy by Francesca Strava-Kopulu,
yes.
But right. So one of the gifts of that book is that she takes us back to the world in which the Hebrew Bible, in which the ancient Israelite deity is, shall we say, invented, comes to be by biblical authors. And that world of Anat, and that world of El, and that world of Marduk, and that world of even if you want to bring them in, various Egyptian gods or even Greek gods, is a world in which these deities are carnal, are physical, and the male deity's primary job is to demonstrate how powerful they are in the face of everything, really. And so, we don't pray to that deity. We don't pray to this deity, but this deity does celebrate his absolutely awesome capacity to wreak complete destruction so that mountains quake and things fall over and his enemies are devastated, and his own men can be regularly punished if they in some way do not demonstrate complete, clear loyalty to him all the time. I mean, just think about the men of Bet Shemesh, who, when the ark is finally returned by the Philistines, dare to look into the ark, into an object that belongs to God, and he slaughters 50 some thousand of them. Right? That's you didn't have my permission to look at the thing that represents me, and you will pay for it, right? So this is a deity of an ancient world in which demonstrating your absolute authority at any cost is part of your ideal masculinity. You are a warrior. You are effectively there in order to prove how well you can kill. And when we talk about this issue of honor, it is a very interesting thing that there is not a single female character of Hebrew Bible who is described with the word honor. Honor only belongs to men, and it belongs more than to anyone else to the deity. And infractions against the deity's honor, as we see repeatedly in these texts, anytime the Israelites do something that is an infraction against his honor and his authority, it's going to be bad. Now, conversely, rather interestingly, this is a deity who also, so I don't want to make this just completely one-sided, always has his arms out. And if you turn back to that deity, he will receive you, right? There is actually always the promise that you can return, you can do teshuvah, you can come back, and God will take you back. So that's never in any doubt, right? That those arms are always out. And if you want to think about this in a gentle, sweet way, right, you can. But it is also the same deity who, with his right arm and right hand, will smite his enemies and his people if they're not giving him the honor and the respect and we would say the kavod that he is due.
I'm glad you said that second part, because I'm a little bit tired of this idea that exists in people's minds that the God of the Hebrew Bible is only vengeance and wrath, and then the God of the New Testament is God of love. But so if you turn back to Adonai, what does that mean? What does that look like for you?
If you turn back to God, you're asking me as a
believing? No, I'm sorry. If you're let's just say a character in Hebrew Bible, if you turn back to Adonai, what does that mean for you?
I see. So I want to speak first to this whole idea of the Hebrew Bible being the wrathful, nasty, mean God, and the New Testament being the nice, loving God. I do a lot of work with churches about this. That idea, which was really born in the supersessionism of the first 300-400 years of the making of Christianity, has had absolutely toxic outcomes. And it is also absurd. As I mentioned, Jesus' clothes are covered in blood in Revelation. And I could, go endlessly on about texts that for me seem quite violent, like, you don't believe in me and you're cast out where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? Like there's, I don't bring peace, I bring the sword. And of course, Christian theologians will do their best to kind of like fix these texts in the same way that they will work to fix texts of Hebrew Bible. All right, we can do that, but we don't win understanding. So what happens when you do teshuvah? I remind my students that while I teach an awful lot about violence and sexual violence in the Hebrew Bible, I could just as easily spend an entire semester speaking about the extraordinary tenderness with which this deity holds his people, right? Like a child, sometimes, right? Now again, for him, his people are men, but those texts can be moved into the space that we have moved them. They are texts of compassion and love and acceptance. If you do that teshuvah, you're done. You're back. And there is nothing that is sundering you from this deity unless you yourself turn away. So I think that is, one of those things about these texts that makes it possible for us to understand that we are redeemed by love and by compassion repeatedly in various of these biblical texts. And they're also coming out of an ancient world in which deities looked like gigantic human beings and behaved, I think, as Stavrakopoulos describes it, God is both the best of us and the worst of us, is the way she puts it in her conclusion. And I think that's true. That's the deity we have in these texts. Now, what we've made of this deity, the intervening 2,000 years, is a completely different being, and that's not a bad thing.
You use the word redeemed in there, and I feel like it would be a missed opportunity if I didn't ask, what do you mean by that? Because I feel like that's a word that's used a lot, and to almost to the point that it doesn't mean anything anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those. If I said, "Hey, what?" If I just asked somebody on the street, what is redemption?" They would be like, "Oh, yeah, we all. I don't know, but I know it when I see it." Right. So what do you mean by redeemed?
Uh, so I think I'm going to be coming here from a Jewish space that is not going to look like what some of your listeners might hear.
Good.
Um, so redemption for me does not mean a particular, oh, I get to go to a certain place after I die, or I get some particular kind of status, or there's some kind of location for me and other special people. No, redemption that truly feels whole to me is the knowledge, and now I'm speaking now as the rabbi and the Jew, right? This is not a secular answer that I'm giving you. This is a theological one. And redemption is the act of being known down to the every cell of my body, being known by what I call God and being understood and accepted with all of the terrific flaws, right? That I am in a space where I am not free to look away from my flaws or my mistakes, but I am accepted in a place where I can look at them with God together. I'm not sundered from that process, because the process of life, the meaning of life, must entail a constant re-evaluation of self in relationship to other human beings, in relationship to non-human animals, in relationship to the planet, right? That is the purpose of redemption, to have that space where I say, I will look at myself safely with you and try to understand why I am here, what I am doing, and what I am meant to do in the time that I have in this form with your help.
Just so you know, so I don't know, like a year or two ago, I asked a friend of mine who is a Christian, like, what do you like? I don't know, what is your eschatology? Where do you think things are going? And what he described to me, and leaving names out of this, is essentially he used the example of a friend of ours who was murdered by her partner in front of their child, and the partner then turned the gun on himself and killed himself. This horrific act, one of the worst things that either of us could conceive of that's happened in our orbit. And he said that man is going to face, in all honesty, who he is. And there will be, I don't know if opportunity is the word, but the potential for, with the acknowledgement to move past, to move through that. And as you were talking, I was thinking of that answer. Like your answer matched very much with what a Christian friend of mine was saying, and I know there's probably some particularities there, but I think that's interesting, and it makes me think of. I'm a little uncomfortable with the term progressive because it's taken on a very specific political connotation, but I think about kind of where its origins lie, and it isn't a kind of an ecumenical thing. If you look at, maybe 100 years ago, what they were attempting to do was to harness nature, to harness technology, to harness knowledge, in the idea that, like, oh, if we can advance, we can continue to advance our circumstances here on Earth. And that was another thing I was thinking of. Again, I kind of ramble. I don't know if there's anything in there you can use. I have more questions written if you need me to refer to those.
Sure. I mean, I will say there's a very lovely Jewish um, conceptual space around what happens after you die, which is like, um, in its way, maybe a kind of an initial hell. And the idea is that you stand before God, and you must then really see all of the damage you have done, the hurt you have caused, the pain you are responsible for. And what happens is that for every one of these things, a little bit of your soul is kind of taken away and taken away and taken away until what is left after all of this is taken away is then, we could say, redeemed or joined to God, brought back and held by God. And I always thought, yeah, well, that first process would be like, that's hellfire, right? To have this all burned away, because there would be a lot. And I remember the first time I heard that, I thought, gosh, what's left for an individual who, for example, commits genocide, organizes, what's left of that person's soul, right? What's left, but is there going to be something left? I have to believe, as your friend does, that yes, that there will be something.
I think it's interesting that there are people who would, and I agree, just so before I say this part, I agree. I like that. That is heartening to me. And I think it's interesting that, much like if you give money to a homeless person in front of some people, they'll try to point out to you like, oh, well, they might be scamming you. Like, I don't care. Hold on. I'm looking at an opportunity to love someone and try to do something for someone. Why would I care if they're, what's my punishment going to be if they're scamming me? So looking at an opportunity to envision a kind of a divine love that says whatever particle of goodness is left in creation, we'll say,
Right.
That thing can be brought back. Like, that thing is worthwhile. Oh, well, what about someone who commits genocide? Yeah, what about someone who commits genocide? Like,
question. According, by the way, to Jewish law, you are not allowed to ask that homeless person, and you are not allowed to pursue that homeless person to find out what they do with the money, right? Like, this is supposed to be completely irrelevant because, again, just as you described it, it is a particular act that you are engaged in, right? That is the thing that is important. Man, yes, I have the same reaction to people who say, oh, they could just be going and buying some alcohol. Well, that's none of my business.
They might have a nicer house than you. Good. I hope they do. That sounds awesome. I don't like that I'm being scammed. I would rather it go to somebody who needs it. But yeah, what do I care that someone else is doing well? So we didn't talk about Abraham very much,
Yes.
but I think, okay, so this is funny because I never had this conception of him, and I'm sorry to pivot because we got pretty heavy there, but I really want to go into this. He seems like a loser.
I don't describe David with many nice words, but I don't describe Abraham with many nice words either. I mean, one of the things that I think, people want very badly to make heroes out of these characters. Um, and so they want Abraham to be like a man of integrity and a man of morals and a man of ethics. And this is a dude who sends, a woman that he's a slave that he's been given to make pregnant, sends her out with her child, her son, into the wilderness potentially to die, willing to sacrifice that one, willing to sacrifice the other one, holds a machelet. The word machelet that's used for that knife means devourer. It's a knife that's used by the Levites when they are sacrificing animals, right? So he's willing to use a sacrificial weapon on his son. He is willing to pimp his wife. No, he is not a particularly admirable fellow in lots and lots of ways. And again, what matters to these biblical authors, right? What matters to them is proving that the deity is the biggest and baddest guy on the block, and his men are his partners in making that proof happen. And to some extent, Jared, I almost want to think, maybe what we should be doing with Hebrew Bible and, frankly, Greek Bible or New Testament is what I just described God doing with us, right? Like, what if we burned away all the stuff that does harm, right? We recognized it, we named it, and we identified it, we honored that it was there, we didn't pretend it wasn't. What if we, in naming all of these things, in identifying all of these things, are also in that same kind of process of figuring out, like, okay, and what is left? What is left? When you take that away, right? Where are the places in which you say, my God, this is the quintessential, extraordinary, ancient moment in which somebody has gotten it regarding love, regarding compassion, regarding mercy, regarding understanding. And I don't think that these authors were any worse or any better at getting those things than we are. Human beings are pretty much the same in any century.
People are people, and we're not that special.
Yeah.
I'm sure my listeners are sick of hearing me say that, but because I say it a lot, but it's absolutely true. It doesn't really matter that they dressed or thought differently. And I mean, we could definitely point to the fact that the people who wrote these stories, their hands were tied, that they had to speak a language and use a discourse that would be familiar to the people engaging with the texts that were being produced.
Mm-hmm.
But we can still read past that, right? I mean, we kind of talked about that earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we need to think about. What we identify and say, no, I'm not walking around this, or I'm not fixing this. I'm just going to let it sit with all of its troubling implications, so that anybody who walks into my church, walks into my synagogue, walks into my setting knows I'm honest, and I'll be honest with them, right? Because again, I think the deity we pray to is one that we believe values our honesty and our integrity. And so let's think about what that means we do with these inherited texts. But yeah, back to Abraham, he's not the greatest dude. He does work really well with God on multiple fronts to get what is needed, which is more glory and more honor for God, as I write about in that chapter about Genesis 12, 20, and 26. But to do it, he engages in some pretty disturbing behaviors. And so does Isaac. Like this whole, sexual exhibitionism stuff that he does with Rebecca, literally forcing her to be sexually engaged with in front of the eyes of other men. That is a truly terrifying moment. And we need to see those things for what they are. They might have been entertaining for the ancient men cisgender heterosexual men who were listening, but they have implications we shouldn't ignore.
Where specifically, just for the listeners' benefit? So, I mean, I remember this from the book. Where is that happening in the
Genesis
story?
26. So Isaac comes in Genesis 26 and does this kind of, oh, she's really just my sister, which effectively makes her available to any man out there, right? She's just my sister, not my wife. And then he is close enough to Avimelech's palace, and that's what's really, really interesting here. He's close enough so that he can be seen, and so that Isaac can hear it when the king calls out to him, "Oh, wait a minute, she's not your sister, or you wouldn't be doing sexual stuff with her like that," right? So yeah, the Hebrew text there is often translated as he's playing with her. It has a very strong sexual connotation.
As we were talking about Abraham, I think 30 years ago, it was probably TNT. They made Abraham, they made David, like they made these made for TV movies, and Abraham was played by Richard Harris. For anyone who's a millennial or younger, the first Dumbledore played Abraham. So you get this depiction of a wizened, patient old man. You're laughing, but that's who he was. He was the first Dumbledore. And I feel like, so I'm thinking, I'm like, ooh, who would I cast? But then before that, my brain interrupted me, and I thought, you know what? If Cecil B. DeMille had made an Abraham movie, he would have cast John Wayne, because he also inappropriately cast Moses. He would have done the same thing, and so you would have had this very strong, masculine figure in John Wayne, probably representing Abraham, which is not the case, because he's a coward. He's lying about who his wife is, much like Isaac is. He's sending. So you said, Hagar sends her away with his son. Sends her away with his son.
Right.
I'm not a fan of deadbeat dads. Like, very much not a fan of deadbeat dads. It's very upsetting.
Very well put.
But what is his purpose? His purpose in the story is as Adonai's vehicle for the covenant. That's what he is, which is funny, because now I'm wondering, so is he like Hira in the story with Judah, where he is kind of the fixer, conciliary type character, or is he more like Tamar, who is just a vehicle? And then that leads me even further to ask, so is there a spectrum where there's masculinity and femininity, or is there only masculinity and it's a zero-sum thing?
Oh gosh. All right. Well, on the Abraham piece, I think that one of the things that I want to think about is that sometimes the inherited text we have was not likely necessarily the way the story might have been told earlier. So an example here is Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. There are at least two hands at work in this story. And if you separate this out, and Jared, I'll be happy to send you what the version looks like that is probably its earlier version, and then you'll see what's been interpolated later. But if you look at that first, likely older strand, Abraham goes up the mountain of Moriah and engages in an act of resistance. He resists the command to slaughter his son and takes the ram instead. Now, a later writer interpolates a bunch of angelic interruptions to this, so that it looks like the whole story is a story about his obedience. But if you separate these strands out, an earlier version of this story is a story of Abraham's disobedience, not his obedience. So I want to acknowledge that the stories that we have, all of which are complex, and as I write in the introduction to the book that I just finished on divine masculinity, I say the Hebrew Bible has a healthy shelf life yet, right? And publishers are always saying, how long is this book going to be valuable before it becomes, unimportant? The Hebrew Bible is probably going to be studied, and so will the Greek Bible, the NT, for as long as I can see into the future, because these texts are multivalent. They have multiple potential readings. And we keep rereading them and keep finding new stuff. And the ones that we have in these texts were not always the only way these stories were told. Right? If we had time to get into the whole apocryphal Enochic version of the story in Genesis 6 of the sons of God coming down and hanging out with human women, right? That's a whole different strand. So the fact that there were strands in which Abraham resists the deity, pushes back, is also something we should acknowledge and remember, right? It's not always as, even as forceful as I am in every book about the claims I'm trying to make, I'm well aware that I don't know everything, and somebody could be calling me a liar in a couple of years because they've figured something better out, or at least misguided. And perspective will change your reading. The questions you ask will elicit different responses. Now that gets us to masculinity and femininity. Masculinity is defined really in relationship to femininity, because the worst thing that can happen to a man in the Hebrew Bible is to be feminized, right? I mean, all you have to do is think about the curse of David cursing Joab in 2 Samuel 2, I think it is, or 3, in which he says, okay, Joab's going to be cursed, and the curse will be that his men will turn to the distaff. They'll become women. Jeremiah 51, same thing. If you want to curse men, curse them with being like women, being weak, being, not being warriors. So masculinity, this is a generally highly binary world, though it's not only binary. If we had time, I could talk about where things get murky there. But it's largely a binary world in which masculinity is effectively defined in relationship to the horror of being feminized. The worst thing that can happen to a man is for him to be in the feminized position. All defeated men in the Hebrew Bible are basically equivalent to a raped woman, right? This is how they are seen. So I would say, women exist in order to confirm and to explain male stories. A good example of that I can give you is just the story of Hannah. People go on and on about, like, look, God gave her a son after all these years of barrenness, how kind of God. But God inflicted this barrenness on her because he had a plan. God makes her barren. It says it in the text. He closed her womb. And Peninnah taunts her more than once with the fact that the deity is the cause of her barrenness. There is no evidence that Hannah did anything wrong. There's no evidence that she's being punished for anything. God just has a plan. He wants that child that she's eventually going to get to be his, and he gets it. She says, if you'll only make me pregnant, I'll give you my son. And all right, now he's got Samuel from the age of about 3 to train, to groom, and to use, right? He effectively makes himself a mini-me, right? That's her body, serves his purpose. And that's frequently, I would say, most of the time, what I keep seeing, that femininity only exists for male purposes, right? To define masculinity and to secure masculinity.
And that is where you end up in the book. So, because I want to respect your time, I want to make sure we get these last two in. And we did talk about the very last question before we started recording. But the second to last question. So where would you send people to learn more about homosociality or any of the things that you discuss in this book, or just any of the things you work on in general?
So the first and best resource that I know of is actually on the Shiloh Project. That is an amazing website. And there is a location where they have an annotated bibliography of work that has been done on sexual violence in particular for decades. It's like the major work that's been done in the last decades is all there. And I would say it includes work on the Greek Bible, the NT. For example, my colleague David Toombs, who is also very interested in what is currently my main interest, which is male-on-male sexual violence. And he wrote a book called The Crucifixion of Jesus, Torture, Sexual Abuse, and the Scandal of the Cross. It's a small book, and it gives you an idea of how is male-on-male sexual violence operating in the narrative of Jesus. It's powerful. It's disturbing. You gotta be in a place for that. I would also, to be fair, if people are really interested in what I do, I wrote a second book called Rape Culture in the House of David, A Company of Men, and I'm really exploring that homosociality a great deal, as I do in the third book. But I would say the Shiloh Project's list for the larger themes of violence and sexual violence, both in Hebrew Bible and in Greek Bible, is just a one-stop shop for people who are interested in following up on this.
I know I'll have that in the show notes, and that's definitely something I'll be searching through to bother some more authors. Now, final question: what do you read for fun?
Oh yeah, the sci-fi or fantasy. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping when I retire to write Jewish fantasy novels. That's my plan. So I really like Ursula Vernon and Alex Harrow for fantasy. They're two female writers. I read them a lot and for fun. Um, but I'm kind of a sucker for even old style sci-fi too. So Zelensky is. I just decided I was going to go back and read a guy who was like really, really famous in the '70s, Robert Zelensky, who wrote the Chronicles of Amber. So I'm trying those out just to see, like, how do they work. I am an obsessive reader, always have been. I also regularly reread Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That's just used to be. I did that every winter when I was much younger. I would say, it's not easy to find good, really well-written fantasy. But for those who are looking for well-written fantasy, Ursula Vernon, who is also known as T. Kingfisher, writes under that name, and Alex Harrow are good examples. There's Adrian, I'm trying to remember his last name.
Tchaikovsky.
Thank you. It's Tchaikovsky.
Yeah.
I like a lot of his work too, especially the ones about the spiders.
Children of Time.
Children of Time. My son turned me onto that. Loved it. He said, "I don't know, Mom. You might not like this because of the bugs and stuff." But I thought that was brilliant work. Brilliant.
So look, my listeners are going to have to just deal with the fact that as I'm reading or having someone read books to me, they're going to hear them recommended because these interviews tend to come pretty much together. But I believe it's Philosopher Tyrants or Tyrant Philosophers. So just a little snippet of it. There's a guy who's a priest to a god who will heal you. Oh, but if you're committed to him, and the commitment you have to make to him is that you will not harm anyone. And if you do, the healing is undone. Whatever healing he did for you is now reversed. And that means if you were on the verge of dying, you're back there on the verge of dying. So that is, I'm in the third book of that series.
This is Adrian Tchaikovsky?
This is Adrian Tchaikovsky, yes.
Okay, need to go read that.
Yeah, it's really, really good. I'm really enjoying it. But we could talk more about that offline. But so you mentioned Ursula. I thought you were going to say Ursula Le Guin.
Oh, she's also one of my all-time favorites. Oh my God, I've read practically everything Ursula Le Guin wrote, including basic essays. I mean, I think the first, I was absolutely and still am. I love her. I do love The Left Hand of Darkness. That was a formative book for me. I mean, of course, her Earthsea stuff is fun. But some of the things she does in world building, where people are addressing some of the most basic questions of how humans work with each other, and where she questions issues around, essentially capitalism. The one thing that I haven't read that I have on my list is A Lathe of Heaven. I haven't read that one. I just recently discovered, this is a Le Guin piece you have not read. You might need to go get that from the library. Yeah, and her essays just on her life, so moving, so tender, and so if you need to get away from the toxicity that we are surrounded by in every single minute of our lives now, Ursula K. Le Guin is a good place to go.
Have you read any N.K. Jemisin?
I have. Like her stuff a lot too.
Yeah.
Very, very much. Yes. Yes.
I'm thinking particularly ending the conversation on Broken Earth Trilogy
Oh,
as
yes,
a series
absolutely. An
that
all-time
centers
favorite.
a female character.
Yes, yes.
Like, can we agree?
Oh,
Listeners, go read those books.
yes, they should. Absolutely, they should read those books. Yeah.
Okay. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
I think we are good, Jared. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And you're welcome back anytime. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Next week on the podcast is Catalin Stefan Popa. He is a Romanian scholar who came across a manuscript that people thought was lost for a couple of 100 years at least. And that's one of those interviews where, like, there are people who are doing some really exciting work, and you would think, old stuff, we found it all. We may have found it and cataloged it, and then we lost it. And I think that may be what happened here. So here's a quick preview of that conversation. I will say before I go, if you get an opportunity to love somebody, you should take it. Bye.
As you may know, Syriac originally lacked a vocalization, which was introduced only later. The manuscript itself is written in an unvocalized Strangelo script with vocalization and some lectionary indications added by later hands. And this is also a characteristic feature of many Gospel manuscripts. So our manuscript is without vocalization. So this was the original text. But then later one, much probably in the 12th century, these monks which used the manuscript as a lectionary added also some vocals on specific words. And I believe this is a valuable argument to consider that vocalization provides evidence of the manuscript's cultural journey, tracing its path from its origin to its later use. And at some point, the manuscript was actively employed, this is very clear, in the liturgical practices of Syriac Orthodox readers.